All right, if you join me just for a quick word of prayer. Lord, I just pray right now that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts would be acceptable to you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Okay, well, as you've seen from the bulletin and so forth by now, I wanted to share with you a little bit about the book of Ruth today. So I'm actually going to share this over 2 Sundays, so you're going to have to stick with this for a little while. But I hope you're going to enjoy it enough that you're going to want to read ahead in the story. First off, how many of you are familiar with the story of Ruth in the Bible? Okay, good. And I'll go ahead and see here. Whoops, I guess I can leave it on this. So I would say I can recall in my life about 4 different encounters with the book of Ruth. The first one, I don't actually remember the details of, but I know I heard this story in Sunday school. Ruth and Naomi, their love for each other, Boaz, who was a good man, and these kinds of things. So I know that's where I first heard this story. The second place I remember encountering this story was actually opening up my world literature textbook in high school. Now, I went to a public high school, so, this is not really where you expect to find a Bible story. But it was included in this textbook, they said, because this is a very old example of the short story genre. It's actually a very well-constructed story from a literary standpoint. The way you have the characters develop, the themes that go through it, the plot elements and so forth. So it's one of our oldest examples of the short story genre. So if you like reading short stories, Book of Ruth is kind of where it starts. The third place and time I remember encountering the book of Ruth was actually in Sierra Leone, West Africa. I was there back in 2004 with a group from Mercy Ships. There was a group of us, about 13. We were on this little team, and we lived out in a rural village there for 2 months working with a local ministry. And while we were there, one of the things they asked us to do was to lead a women's Bible study. So my friend Elsa from Norway and I were trying to think what were we going to talk about. And we decided the book of Ruth would be a good place to start. There were a lot of things we could talk about in that, and it's a fun story to tell. So we shared this story with the ladies in this Bible study. The fourth time I encountered the book of Ruth was actually just a few weeks ago at a women's retreat that one of my friends invited me to go to. And the speaker for the weekend was a woman named, appropriately enough, Ruth. Her name was Ruth Harder, and she's actually the pastor of Rainbow Mennonite Church in Kansas City. And she just shared some things that I had never heard before with this story and really applied it in some neat ways. And one of the things I also appreciated was that she brought along the books that she'd been studying and reading as she'd been preparing her material. And so I got a chance to look at the books that she had been using and got interested to read those. So the 2 books that in particular that she had mentioned was one called The Gospel of Ruth. It's by Carolyn Custis James, who is a biblical scholar and writer. And the other is a book called The Story of Ruth by Joan Chittister, and who is a nun and has this beautiful artwork by John August Swanson. So a lot of what I'm sharing with you today comes from those 2 things, as well as, of course, our text. So here are 4 kind of guiding principles as we're looking at this book. This is from Carolyn Custis James. And she says, 4 things to kind of keep in mind as we read this story. First off is that God is the hero of this story. Every story that we find in the Bible is there for a reason. It's to teach us something about God's character and how God relates to people. So ultimately, the hero of this story is God, working out God's purposes in the lives of these people that we encounter. The second thing is that it really is a good illustration of God's design, that women and men serve God together, that each is vital. What she goes on to say is that, she reminds us that this story tells us that men and women are image bearers. We're made in the image of God. And what that means is we're made to know God, to become like Him, and to represent Him in our interactions with others. And so keep that in mind as these characters interact. How are they being image bearers of God? The third thing is we have to learn about the culture of that time. There's a lot of customs and traditions and things going on in this story that are very different from our lives. So it's helpful to know a little bit of the background and some insights on that. And she comments too that a lot of our brothers and sisters in the third world, some of their cultures are a lot more like the culture that these characters are living in. And sometimes they have some good insights for us. And fourthly, keep in mind that themes carry through the whole story. So what's the questions that are brought up in chapter 1, the things that are going on there, carry on through the whole story. It is really a literary whole, and to understand the actions and motivations of the characters, kind of have to keep in mind what's been going on. Okay, so without further ado, let's read chapter 1 of Ruth. If you want to find it, it's in your pew Bibles. I'm sorry I don't know the page number, but it's in the Old Testament. You can find it in the index. But I'll read it so you can just listen along if you like. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So, this is where we start. This is a chapter with an awful lot of loss going on in it. And really, in it, I can see about 4 major losses. First off, this famine that happened. When the family moved to Moab, they weren't relocating for better schools or a job or a nice climate. They were going there because they were starving. So they're living in a foreign country, separated from their family, from their culture. You know, they're living as foreigners here. That's the first tragedy. And then, of course, the second one is that Elimelech died. So here they are, with the father of the family gone. And then Mahlon and Chilion also died. And finally, there's one other loss in here that isn't explicitly said in the text, but if you remember back in there, Mahlon and Chilion, they were married for 10 years to Ruth and Orpah, and there's no mention of any children. So we can conclude that Ruth and Orpah were barren. They either weren't able to have children, or perhaps they had suffered miscarriages or had children die in infancy. In any case, these are, huge tragedies that they've gone through. So I read you just a little passage from this nun, Joan Chittister, how she describes kind of a little bit what's going on. She says, moments of great loss throw a woman back on her own assets, with little in the way of external resources to barter, money, social connections, education. It is what a woman is inside herself that will have to count. It is her faith in the ultimate logic of God in her life that is her only real resource. Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah are women coping with loss. Like most women in the world, even today, the lives of Naomi and her daughters-in-law are tied to the fortunes of the men whose work and position have shaped their worlds. They have lost the men in their lives and, with the men, their social status and economic security as well. What happens to them now rests entirely on them and their trust in the fullness of their own creation. It's a moment of deep spiritual revelation. Naomi is an old woman without assets. Ruth and Orpah are young women with sparse options. They can try to find a man to support them, if they're lucky, or they can remain widows and throw themselves on the grudging mercy of the community at large. Naomi and Ruth and Orpah are alone in the world now. They have only one another and God. Like anyone ever born who goes through sudden, defining loss of any kind, these women find themselves faced with the question, who am I when I am no longer who and what I was? Like the rest of us, there are no miracles in sight to save them, no angels on the road to point the way, nothing. Everything they had, everything they thought they wanted, is gone. There are no anchors to steady them, no safety nets to catch them. Now they have only themselves on which to depend, only the Spirit of God to lead them on through a world that has little place for them at all. And indeed, the Hebrew word for widow has a couple of meanings. I like that last week our guest preacher, Greg Mamula, said that, Hebrew words, they have lots of potential meanings. And there were two that I found that were mentioned. One is that the word for widow in Hebrew means silent one or voiceless one. Because in this culture, without a man, you really don't have a voice. And another possible meaning of the word for widow is the leftover piece. The widow is what's left over of the man's life. Doesn't sound very valuable in the eyes of this culture. They don't have opportunities for education or employment. And I really like this picture. I think the mourning and the loss there is a good picture. They've had to bury people that they loved. And that's the other thing. It's not just that they lost their social standing and their, economic position, but they've lost people that they really love. Some of you know my uncle died at the end of August, and we went to the funeral. And after that, we went to a concert, and one of the musicians was talking about grief, and he said, grief is love with nowhere to go. And I really thought that made a lot of sense. You love someone, you care about them, but they're gone. Grief is love with nowhere to go. And I think that's what these women are experiencing and what we often experience. But there is one glimmer of hope. The Lord came to the aid of his people by providing food. So Naomi makes the decision, we're going to go back. Let's go back to Bethlehem, back where she's from. But along the way, Naomi reconsiders, and she really makes a very generous sacrifice in releasing her daughters-in-law, and she urges them to go back home, and she blesses them. She says, may the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. So she's considered what would be best for them. Not what's best for her, but what's best for them. And they would be foreigners in her home country. They should stay in their home. And Ruth and Orpah, at first they resist, and then Naomi says, no, let me spell this out for you. Your future would be bleak. I don't have any more sons for you to marry. and there's no chance of you marrying someone. What she refers to in this text about having more sons and so forth is a practice called levirate marriage, and it's a provision that's outlined in Deuteronomy 25, because it's so important for a man to have sons. If he dies without any sons, then his brother is expected to marry the widow and kind of serve as a surrogate for him. And then the first son that's born to that couple is considered the son, the legal heir of the dead brother who didn't have any kids. And it's kind of a big deal that this is supposed to be an important family responsibility. In our culture, this just sounds completely nuts. But in their time, this was considered a very important responsibility. If your brother died and didn't have any sons and his name was going to be wiped out, you had to try to save his family and have a kid for him. But what Naomi's saying is, I don't have any more sons back in Bethlehem who are going to marry you. So there's really no possibility of that. And so Orpah makes a very sensible choice here. She's not abandoning Naomi. Naomi has blessed her and released her. But she makes a sensible choice to go back home, where at least things are familiar and at least she has family. And this just makes Ruth's decision stand out even more. So we have Ruth's vow. She says, no, I'm going to stay here with you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates us. What does this kind of sound like? Anybody recognize till death do us part? Some of those things. It sounds like marriage vows, right? And it's kind of neat. That's, I think, probably where some of those traditional marriage vows come from. She's making this really deep commitment here. And what's important to note about this, too, is when she's making this crazy decision, this choice that does not look like it's in her best interest, she's making a choice not just to go with Naomi, but she says, your God will be my God. She's lived for 10 years with this family. This is not the culture she grew up with. This is not the God that she grew up serving and worshiping. But something about being within this family and getting to know them and this relationship she's built with them, she sees this now. No, she doesn't want to go back to the gods of her people. She wants to follow Yahweh, the living God. And so this is her pledge. This is her faith, showing that she has faith in God and trust in God. And in a lot of ways, she's a little bit like Abraham, called to leave her homeland and the gods of her people and to follow God into a new place, a place that's unknown to her. So this is a really key moment when she makes this vow, not only that she's going to stick with Naomi, but that she's chosen to follow God, that she's going to be a follower and a believer in God. So keep this vow will continue to be important. And here you have the two of them, these two women, kind of alone in the world. But there's the two of them, but there's also God. So they return to Bethlehem. And here's kind of a scene. The main thing I like about this is that they're carrying their stuff on their heads. It's kind of cool. So, yeah, they probably were too poor to have an animal to carry their stuff. They had to carry it all. So they arrived back in Bethlehem, and it really causes a stir. We got to remember, this is before you had mail service. It certainly wasn't Facebook. Naomi left at least 10 years ago, and here she is coming back, and everyone's excited in this small town, and want to know what's been happening, what's going on. They almost don't recognize Naomi. And of course, they remember Naomi as a woman who was married with 2 sons. And instead, she comes back by herself with this other woman that they've never met. And I remember that the women in Sierra Leone, when we talked about this, we asked them, what would you think about that? If somebody who had left your village a long time ago came back, and they brought with them somebody from another place who was going to come live with you. And they were very interested. They said, yeah, we'd have a lot of questions about this person and what happened and what's going on. They would be very interested. And they would see this as very remarkable, to leave your family and what's familiar to you and come here. And they said something about Ruth that I haven't heard any of the commentators mention. They said about Ruth, they said, oh, this woman to do this? They said she must have really, truly loved her dead husband. That she would be so committed to taking care of his mother. That shows such a deep love that was there. And I think that's really a neat thing to see in that as well. And certainly I think too for the women in Bethlehem, you know, they saw this as pretty remarkable, and they knew that Ruth, she's a foreigner, but she's a pretty remarkable woman, brave and loving to do what she's doing. Now remember, this has got to be a little hard for Naomi. It's hard to come back to this place. I mean, on one hand, it's good, it's your home, but there's all kinds of memories of the happy times you had together as a family. And she says this, she says, don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. She says, call me Mara, which is bitter. Because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. These are hard words. But these are words of a woman who has lived as a believer in God, who has followed God and trusted God, and she's really struggling with what's happening, why this has happened. And she's asking a difficult question here. She's wondering, has God's goodness run out for me? All the tragedies that have happened. And I think one of the things to keep in mind here is, you know, sometimes people say, oh, she's just kind of bitter old woman about this. No, she's wrestling with an important faith question here, and one that I think we all wrestle with sometimes when difficult things happen. Where is God's goodness in this? And some commentators now say, you know, we've got to think of her as kind of a female version of Job. She's asking the same kind of questions that Job is asking in all the terrible things that happened to him. And she's asking God. She's staying in relation with God about this. And, you know, this is the big question for her. So in this passage and in many other examples, the Bible kind of shows us that it's okay to ask hard questions. But it also shows us that God often doesn't explain. She doesn't necessarily get an explanation why this happens, and we often don't get an explanation for why these things happen. But again, so there's a question. Has God's goodness run out for Naomi? And so I want to read you one other little thing that Joan Chittister said. She says, there are spiritual lessons to be learned from loss that can be barely divined by any other means, and often despite ourselves. We learn just when we think we have nothing, just when it feels that we have not one good thing left in the world, that what we do still have is ourselves. We have deep down inside us what no one can take away, what can never be lost either to time or to chance. We have the self that brought us to this point, and more. We have gifts of God in abundance, never noticed, never touched, perhaps, but a breath in us nevertheless, and waiting to be tapped. And more, whatever we have developed over the years in the center of ourselves, the grit, the hope, the calm, the bottomless, pulsating, irrepressible trust in the providence of God, despite the turns of fortune, is here now to be mined like gold, scratched out and melted down, shaped and shined into a whole new life. We have within us the raw materials of life, and we have it for the taking. So, let's take a look at chapter 2. Now that we've gotten the vow here that Ruth has made, and we have Naomi's lament and her question about whether God's goodness has run out for her. Okay. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi, let me go out in the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they called back. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" The foreman replied, "She is the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to her, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I've told the men not to touch you, and whenever you're thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told about all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she'd eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she'd been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead," she added. "That man is our close relative. He's one of our kinsman redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with his girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Okay, so in this chapter, they're back in Bethlehem, and Ruth is sticking to her promise. She says, "Okay, let me go out and glean. Let me see what I can do to provide for us." And anybody familiar with this practice of gleaning? Do you know what it means? So it's basically that they can go and pick up whatever's left over after they've come through and harvested. I think it's a little bit ironic. The widows, the leftover pieces, get the leftover pieces. But it is a provision, actually, in Leviticus 24, 19 to 24, and also in Deuteronomy. This is mentioned in chapter 19 and 23. So God tells the people, in this land, you need to leave something behind for the poor, for the widows, for the aliens who are living in your land. Don't harvest your fields all the way to the edge. Don't harvest the corners. You leave that for them so that they too can have something and they have the dignity of being able to gather some food. So that is the instruction, and Ruth has learned about this, so she knows, okay, well, here's an opportunity. I can go glean. I can gather up this grain. Okay. And so that's what's going on. So she goes out there. And then Boaz, who is obviously the landowner of this field where she happens to be, he comes and he greets his workers. He says, "The Lord be with you." And they respond, "The Lord bless you." And this is a bit of a clue. Aha. Hey, here are people who are living under God. He's called a man of standing, a man of valor. He's a respected man in the community. And probably for good reasons, because as we see, he really leads by example. And he blesses Ruth. He takes notice of what she's doing, and this means a great deal. So here's a little passage about this, with Ruth being out there working. It says, "Ruth levels the playing field between rich and poor, men and women, not by wheeling deals or kowtowing to the mighty, not by simpering and whimpering, not by playing a damsel in distress, but by having the kind of character that people of character can recognize and must respect. Ruth carries the dignity of creation within her and brings everyone around her to see it too. And Boaz is one of those people. He sees what she's doing and recognizes her character. And he says to her, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So he, sees that, yes, he's making her feel welcome. I think this is got to be a pretty good moment for Ruth. Not sure where she's going to end up, and here she's in this field, and not only is she allowed to glean, but she's treated kindly and made to feel welcome. And, not only that, he invites her to eat with the work crew when they take a break. And think about it. This might be the first real meal she's had in quite a while. They are very poor. So he invites her to eat, and he also instructs his workers, the harvesters, to drop some extra grain for her and to, let her gather that. And she tells Ruth that she's welcome to stay in his fields. We don't know. Other fields might not have been like that. Just because this is in God's word that you're supposed to allow the poor to do these things doesn't mean everybody was doing it. In fact, probably a lot of people weren't. It's like, wait a minute, no. You're a foreigner. You're not welcome in this field. Or we're not sure we're going to have enough harvest for ourselves, so we're not allowing anybody to glean. But like I say, he really leads by example here. And so Ruth returns home at the end of the day carrying an ephah of grain. Now, anybody know how much an ephah is? I didn't either. So we'll have to take it on the word of these Bible scholars, but they say it's probably about 29 pounds of grain. So this is a lot of grain, especially for someone that's picking up the leftover pieces. In that day and time, they estimate a day's wages for a worker would be about 2 pounds of grain. So she just brought home about 2 weeks' worth of wages in one day of gleaning. So obviously Naomi realizes this is remarkable. I mean, that she got to glean this much grain out of someone's field. And, this is a spark of hope for Naomi. Wait a minute. Maybe we're not completely forgotten. And so she of course asks Ruth, well, where have you been? Where did you get this much grain? And so Ruth tells her about what happened in her day and how she was gleaning in the field of a man named Boaz. And as soon as she hears Boaz, oh, bless Boaz, she says. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, this man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. He's showing his kindness to the living and the dead. He's a relative. He's someone from Elimelech's family. And in being kind to Ruth and by extension to Naomi, he's remembering. He's showing regard for Elimelech and for Mahlon and Chilion by saying, yeah, I'm going to be helpful here to these women who are part of my family. So what we see really in this chapter is Boaz goes beyond the letter of the law with the gleaning, and he really embraces the spirit of it. The question is, how wide is the edge of a field? How big is a corner? That's always one of those things. Well, I left a corner and an edge that wide, or I left an edge that wide. People can get caught up in that, but he understands the spirit of it, and he's acting in the spirit of this law, which is to be generous. And of course, Ruth has a lot of things against her. She's a foreigner. She's a widow. She's a woman. But he really embraces what God is trying to say in these laws. And this is just a passage out of Leviticus. He says, God says, when an alien lives with you in your land, do not mistreat him. The alien must be treated as one of your native born. Love him as yourself, for you were aliens in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Love him as one of your own. And I think a lot of times we've sung that song and, about when we know about what are the commandments according to Jesus, love God, love your neighbor. And that's kind of reflected in this. Treat him as one of your native born. Love him as yourself. And in this, God is also reminding the people, he's saying, hey, you were aliens. You were in Egypt, and you were treated very, very badly there. Remember that. That's not the way things work in my kingdom. That's not the way you're supposed to treat an alien. Instead, love them. Treat them kindly. Don't mistreat them. And he says, I love that it always ends with, I am the Lord your God. I'm sure we could come up with plenty of reasons not to do so. Boaz could have said, well, but we've had all these years of bad harvest. I don't know that I can afford to give up, what percent of my yield, for the poor. But this, but that. We could come up with all those things. But God says, no, I am the Lord your God. Remember that you serve me, and this is what I'm asking you to do. So, at this point, we can say, to be continued. If you're interested, go ahead and read ahead, chapter 3 and 4, and we'll talk some more about those